1934, August. The dust of Fort Benning, Georgia, tasted like chalk and defeat. The War Department was playing a dangerous game of catch-up on a desperately thin shoestring budget. During maneuvers in the mid-1930s, Major Thomas Vance stood beside a canvas-topped 1.5-ton truck. He was watching the future of warfare disappear over a distant rise. Ahead of him, the handful of early M2 light tanks rattled and sputtered, vanishing in a plume of oil smoke. They were achieving speeds the accompanying riflemen could not dream of matching. Behind those tanks, the follow-on forces, the infantry, were trapped in a logistical nightmare. Vance watched the overloaded truck, carrying a dozen sweating men, attempt to cross a stretch of broken ground. The vehicle bucked violently, its standard rubber tires spinning uselessly in the soft earth. The driver fought the wheel, cursing as the chassis bottomed out with a metallic groan. The entire column ground to a halt. "Look at that, Sergeant," Vance muttered, pulling his campaign hat lower to shield his eyes from the glare. "We have mechanized cavalry, but absolutely no mechanized infantry." He realized those men might as well be on roller skates once the tanks committed to the fight. The truth was stark. The United States Army was clinging desperately to the ghosts of 1918. Their tanks were faster, yes, but their combat transport consisted entirely of civilian-grade trucks with thin skins and zero cross-country capability. To deposit infantry into a firefight using such vehicles was simply to deliver them, unarmored, directly into the enemy's main line of fire. They lacked the protection to survive the approach and the mobility to keep pace with the vanguard. The logical answer, of course, was a fully tracked personnel carrier, a true armored box. But the cost was prohibitive. Defense budgets had been threadbare for a decade, leaving the army reliant on cast-off equipment. A fully tracked vehicle meant immense expense, complexity, and maintenance demands that the brass believed they could not meet. Necessity, therefore, dictated compromise. The engineers turned back to old ideas, resurrecting the concept of the half-track. This hybrid was born of the need to combine the steering stability of wheels with the essential traction of tracks. They were searching for the sweet spot, a vehicle cheap enough to mass-produce, yet rugged enough to traverse the battlefield. By 1936, the T9 half-track truck was ready for evaluation at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The vehicle was crude, essentially a standard truck frame with the rear axle replaced by a bogie assembly. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil and the metallic tang of new rubber. The goal was simple: prove that the front wheels and the rear tracks could synchronize their efforts without violently tearing themselves apart. An engineer named Jenkins stood on the test course embankment, clipboard in hand, his nerves taut. The T9 approached a man-made obstacle, a deep, slick ditch designed specifically to halt any standard truck. The vehicle slowed, the front tires bit into the mud, and for a moment the observers held their breath. Then, the newly developed endless rubber band tracks, vulcanized rubber laced over steel cabling, fiercely engaged. Instead of spinning and digging in, the tracks gripped the embankment. A deep, resonant thrum came from the engine as the T9 pulled itself forward. The front wheels guided the direction, while the tracks provided relentless, continuous propulsion. It was not fast, but it was unstoppable. "It works," Jenkins whispered, a wide grin spreading across his face. "It actually holds the line." The T9 proved the mechanical feasibility of the concept. The next step was hardening the design for combat use. The Army took its existing, lightly armored M2 Scout car, a four-wheeled design, and began converting it. The T7, and its heavily modified successor, the T14, retained the familiar front axle and steering. Crucially, they traded the rear wheels for the robust track assembly. The T14, fitted with an uprated engine capable of handling the increased weight, demonstrated conclusively that the half-track was not just feasible for logistics, but truly viable for frontline military utility. Then, history intervened, violently. 1940, May. The news filtering back from Europe was terrifyingly clear. The German panzer divisions had not merely defeated France, they had shredded it, bypassing fixed defences and driving deep into the rear. At the heart of this lightning war was the armoured personnel carrier, notably the distinctive sloping-nosed Sada KFC's 251 half-track. It was the physical embodiment of the doctrine the United States Army had been unable to afford: armoured infantry keeping pace with the tanks. The debate over cost and complexity evaporated overnight as The necessity was no longer theoretical. It was an existential threat to the free world. If the United States were to mobilize an armored force capable of meeting the Wehrmacht, it needed a vehicle, and it needed it immediately. The decision was made to standardize two variants based on the T-14's success. The M2 Half-Track car was designed to be shorter and optimized for artillery support and reconnaissance. The M3 Half-Track personnel carrier was a lengthened version designed explicitly for troop transport. Contracts were swiftly awarded to Autocar, White Motor Company, and Diamond T Motor Company, the new armored divisions, the first of which began forming in July 1940, were no longer going to wait for the infantry to catch up. They would ride into battle. The M3, powered by the reliable White 160 Axe gasoline engine and built around the Timken running gear, was approved for production in October 1940. It was a compromise born of financial hardship and tactical desperation, but it was ready to roll. The age of the armored doe had finally begun. The contracts were signed, the tooling hammered out, and the assembly lines at Autocar, White, and Diamond T began to roar. They were spitting out M2 half-track cars and M3 personnel carriers at a furious, necessary pace. The vehicles were rough, utilitarian, and built for speed, not comfort. The M3 was the answer to the immediate, desperate need to clothe the newly formed armored divisions in steel. It allowed the infantry to keep pace with the tanks as doctrine demanded. But doctrine and reality rarely align on the first attempt. For the men of the Provisional Tank Group, the combat debut of the M3 was not a triumphant sweep across a European plain. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble in the crushing humidity of the Far East. 1941 United States forces, caught flat-footed by the Japanese invasion, found their mechanized infantry thrown into a brutal, unrelenting jungle defense. Private First Class Eddie Rinaldi rode in an early M3. The heat radiating off the White 160AX engine made the air inside the armored box feel thick and poisonous. They were attempting to move a rifle squad forward to reinforce a collapsing line near Clark Field. The endless rubber band tracks, designed for the moderate terrain of Europe, chewed up the tropical soil. But the vehicle felt heavy, sluggish, and far too exposed. The half-track halted abruptly, the metallic clank of the tracks ceasing. That sound was instantly replaced by the sharp crack of Japanese small arms fire. "Dismount, dismount," the squad leader screamed frantically. Rinaldi threw himself over the side, tasting the sulphurous tang of cordite mixed with the pervasive smell of jungle rot. He looked back at the M3. The vehicle, meant to be a shield, had instantly become a high-priority target. Japanese rounds, impacting the thin, quarter-inch face-hardened armor, did not always penetrate, yet they struck with a sound like a blacksmith hitting an anvil, sending lethal spall ricocheting violently through the troop compartment. The M3 had no overhead protection, a decision made to save weight and maximize visibility. Now, that compromise was costing lives. A burst of fire from a Nambu machine gun tore across the top of the vehicle. The rounds passed directly over the heads of the men who had been sitting on the facing seats, desperately seeking cover. The lieutenant, attempting to bring the M250 caliber machine gun into action on the skate rail mount, cursed violently. The rail jammed, forcing him to dangerously expose his torso just to swing the heavy weapon toward the threat. The lessons were immediate, and they were violent. The M3 was critical for mobility, allowing the troops to get to the fight, but it was dangerously fragile once the fighting started. The defeat in the Pacific was total, but the half-track survived to fight another day. Thousands more were rolling off the assembly lines, destined for the massive build-up in North Africa. 3 months of grueling travel brought the mechanized infantry of the 1st Armored Division to the arid, unforgiving terrain of Tunisia. They were green, they were confident, and they were utterly unprepared for the ferocity of the German mechanized counterattack. The crucible came in January and February of 1943, near Sidi Bouzid and the infamous Kasserine Pass. Sergeant Frank Dusty Rhodes of the 6th Armored Infantry Regiment felt the cold of the desert night seep into his bones, even through the thin steel of his vehicle. The air was heavy with anticipation, the only sound the low, rhythmic idle of the white engines. When the German assault began, it did not come as a wave. It came as a concentrated, crushing blow of armor and artillery. The M3s, tasked with keeping pace with the M4 Shermans, found themselves caught in a maelstrom of direct fire. Rhodes watched as the German anti-tank guns, often the dreaded 88mm, began to pick off the tanks, but it was the machine gun and light cannon fire that proved deadly to the accompanying infantry. Rhodes's half-track, swerving violently to avoid a crater, suddenly bucked. The stream of automatic fire from a German light cannon struck the left flank. The quarter-inch armor, designed only to stop rifle rounds and shrapnel, failed instantly against the heavier weapon. The impact sounded like a sheet of tin being ripped apart. Inside the compartment, the air filled with the acrid smell of burning paint and the metallic shriek of shrapnel. The rifleman scrambled out, leaving behind a spray of blood and shredded gear. Rhodes felt the chilling realization that had begun to spread through the ranks. The M3 was not a true armored personnel carrier. It was simply a shell. Purple Heart boxes, the riflemen started calling them, the sarcasm laced with genuine terror. They knew the thin armor meant that incoming bullets rarely exited the other side. The projectiles simply rattled around inside the hull, ensuring a wound if not a death. The lack of overhead protection meant that even routine mortar fire or airburst shrapnel could decimate a concentrated squad. After the humiliating defeat at Kasserine, the criticism was scathing. Officers of the Provisional Tank Group delivered damning reports. The half-track was expensive, difficult to maintain, and its protection was practically nil against bombing and artillery. The Ordnance Department was caught in a tactical bind. They understood the problem completely, but they were paralyzed by the original design compromise. Any significant increase in armor thickness, say, enough to stop a 20mm cannon, would seriously degrade the mobility of the vehicle. This would turn the half-track into a slow, vulnerable target. Mobility, the ability to follow the tanks across broken terrain inaccessible to standard trucks, was the entire reason for the vehicle's existence. Yet, some senior leaders saw the problem differently. General Omar Bradley, observing the chaos, countered the prevailing mood. He assessed the M3 not as a failure of engineering, but as a failure of leadership. The half-track was a competent and dependable contrivance. Its bad name, he argued, was the result of the inexperience of our troops who attempted to use it for too many things. They were treating a fast, armored transport vehicle like an assault gun or a bunker. The infantry still needed to be delivered closer to the objective, unencumbered by heavy gear. Only the half-track could consistently manage that task. The combat feedback loop, however, was already in motion. The terrible skate rail, mount awkward, slow, and dangerous to the gunner, was the first thing to go. By May 1943, the Ordnance Department introduced the M3A1 variant. This featured the improved M49 machine gun mounting. It was a circular armored pulpit that allowed the gunner to swivel the .50 caliber heavy machine gun a full 360 degrees. This finally addressed the deadly problem of targets appearing suddenly from unexpected angles. The half-track was far from perfect, but the lessons of the sand and the jungle had been learned in blood. It would not be replaced yet. It would be refined, adapted, and forced to endure the next trial. The bloody, chaotic gypsy caravan advanced through the orchards and mountains of Sicily. The M3 half-track was a battlefield chameleon. Its inherent limitations as a troop carrier, the thin armor and the open top, were suddenly assets when engineers looked to mount heavy weaponry. The chassis, relatively cheap and abundantly available, became the foundation for a whole new mechanized arsenal. This arsenal was born from the brutal, immediate demands of the North African campaign. The most urgent need was for mobile anti-tank firepower. Rushed into service, the 75mm gun motor carriage, or M3 GMC, was developed. This was essentially a standard M3 with its rear compartment cut open to accommodate a modified 75mm field gun. Its fuel tanks were moved to the rear corners, and initially it lacked a coherent armored shield, exposing the gun crew directly to enemy fire. In March 1943, near El Ghoutar, the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion put the M3 GMC to the test against the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. Sergeant Willie Red Dawson clung to the side of his M3 GMC, the desert wind whipping sand into his eyes. The roar of the White 160-axe engine was a dull, constant percussion beneath the sharp cracks of nearby German artillery. His vehicle was a precarious blend of speed and vulnerability. The 75mm gun, mounted low in the hull, offered decent punch. It delivered about 3 inches of armor penetration at 1,000 yards, with an M61 armor-piercing capped round. but the vehicle itself remained an open invitation to disaster. Ahead, the German counterattack was gaining momentum. Two massive shapes, dark grey and menacing, emerged from the haze. Tiger 1 heavy tanks, elevation. "Traverse right, damn it, traverse right," Dawson screamed over the din. The driver, following standard operating procedure, was forced to abandon his forward position as the gun fired. The muzzle blast from the 75mm weapon was so severe it would have shattered the driver's eardrums and possibly injured him had he remained forward of the breach. He scrambled back into the troop compartment, taking cover behind the ammunition boxes stacked in the rear. Dawson saw the flash from the first Tiger's long 88mm gun. The sound arrived a terrifying fraction of a second later, a deafening crack. This was followed by the shriek of a near miss that kicked up a geyser of sand 15 yards away. The M3 GMC was a designated tank killer, but against a Tiger, it was a suicide mission. Dawson knew they had to hit the giant cat repeatedly. They had to hit it precisely on the flank or the rear. He gave the order. The M3 GMC bucked violently as the 75mm round left the barrel. The acrid smoke of burning propellant instantly filled the small fighting space. Clang! The shell struck the Tiger's front glacis plate. It was a solid hit, but the heavy armor simply shrugged it off. The duel was desperate and short. The 601st fought with savage tenacity. They managed to destroy 2 Tigers and claim 30 German tanks overall that day. But the cost was catastrophic. 21 3 GMCs were lost. The lesson was learned in blood. The M3 chassis, while highly mobile, simply could not survive dedicated anti-tank combat against main battle tanks. By 1943, as the superior, fully tracked M10 GMC began to arrive, the M375mm GMC was strategically relegated. It did not disappear, it simply shifted roles. It became an effective piece of mobile artillery support, firing high-explosive rounds from a distance rather than attempting to trade punches with heavy armor. Yet the adaptability of the chassis continued to prove invaluable. The need for mobile artillery was immediately met by 2 new variants, the T30 75mm HMC and the T19 105mm HMC. These vehicles allowed cannon companies to keep pace with the swift armored columns. Colonel Bryce Deno watched T19s near Oran. He described them fanning out like tanks to concentrate fire. Their cannoneers were often engaging the enemy at close range with carbines and hand grenades. But the most iconic and enduring transformation of the half-track came in the realm of air defense. The early M13 and M14 multiple-gun motor carriages, mounting twin 50-caliber machine guns, were quickly superseded. They were replaced by the devastating M16 MG-MC. This vehicle mounted the M45 quad 50-caliber machine gun mount. It was a terrifying mechanism that could fire 4 heavy machine guns simultaneously. As the Allies achieved air superiority over Europe, the M16 was increasingly freed from its primary anti-aircraft role. It found a far deadlier use on the ground. But by January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had turned the Ardennes forest into a frozen, muddy slaughterhouse. The pervasive mud had given way to ice and snow, but the fighting remained close quarters and brutal. American infantry, often pinned down by entrenched German positions, began to rely on the M16 for direct fire support. For this role, it was lethally suited. Sergeant Dale Rourke stood shivering in the snow. His M1 Garand was uselessly pointed toward a thick line of trees where German machine guns were tearing apart his platoon. The cold had settled deep into his bones, a feeling he could not shake. "Get the meat chopper up here," Rourke screamed into his radio, using the grim nickname the M16 had earned. Moments later, the M16 arrived, its tracks crunching through the frozen earth. The gunner in the armored pulpit, bundled against the cold, swung the M45 mount toward the tree line. The vehicle stopped. The roar of the engine suddenly changed pitch as the gunner depressed the firing pedal. The sound was not a burst, but a continuous ripping tear. This was 1,000 rounds per minute of heavy-caliber steel slicing through the air. Tracer rounds, like crimson ribbons, stitched a line of utter destruction across the German position. Trees were shredded. The snow turned instantly into plumes of churned earth and splinters. The M16 was designed to stop fighter bombers. Against thin wood and human flesh, it was precise and devastating overkill. The German fire ceased instantly. Rourke watched the M16 continue to pepper the area, the smell of cordite thick and sharp in the freezing air. The vehicle, designed as a compromise between mobility and protection, was now fulfilling a role that transcended its original intent. Whether it was the M3 GMC covering a retreat in Tunisia or the M16 clearing a bunker in the Ardennes, the half-track had become the very definition of ingenuity born of necessity. It was a competent, dependable contrivance that, despite its bad name, had fundamentally enabled the transition of the US Army into a mechanized fighting force. The war ended, and the roar of the M3's white engine, once the sound of American mechanized liberation, began to fade. The lessons learned from the Ardennes to the Rhine were conclusive. The half-track was a magnificent stopgap, a crucial bridge that allowed the US Army to transition to mechanized warfare. But its time as a frontline troop carrier was definitively over. The compromises that had defined its existence, the thin, open-topped armor designed to save weight, were simply too dangerous in the face of emerging threats. Its limitations in mobility, particularly the tendency for the front wheels to bog down in deep mud or snow compared to a fully tracked vehicle, sealed its fate. The future of the armored doe lay entirely with the fully tracked chassis, capable of offering complete overhead protection and superior cross-country performance. The M3 had facilitated the transition to mechanized warfare. Now that transition demanded its replacement. But while the M3 was being retired from US primary service, its sheer ubiquity meant its story was far from finished. Over 41,000 had been produced. The half-track became a global commodity, distributed under the military aid program and sold off as surplus. Many were stripped of their armor and repurposed. The versatile chassis found new life hauling logs in the Pacific Northwest or grading roads across the American plains. The M3 was now a utilitarian workhorse, its primary military service seemingly over. Yet, across the globe, in new conflicts and desperate young nations, the M3 was just beginning its second life. In the humid, steaming jungles of French Indochina in the early 1950s, the M3A1s, acquired by the French army, churned through the pervasive mud. Their tracks provided the only reliable mobility for columns moving outside the few paved roads. Years later, in the late 1960s, the South Vietnamese ARVN still relied on the familiar boxy silhouette of the M3s to move troops through the contested rice paddies and hamlets. The vehicles were dated, but they were dependable. They offered a degree of protection and speed that standard trucks could not match. Nowhere was the M3's enduring utility and adaptability more dramatically proven than in the Middle East. Israel, facing chronic equipment shortages and immediate existential threats, the half-track was not a piece of surplus, it was the backbone of their armored infantry. They acquired International Harvester M3s, often smuggled into Palestine before the 1948 war. They immediately began modifying them, turning the platform into a national symbol of ingenuity. They upgunned M5 half-tracks with British 6-pounder anti-tank guns. Later, they mounted French SS-11 wire-guided missiles. By 1966, they fitted 120mm Sultan mortars into the open-topped chassis. But the ultimate evolution of the M3 chassis came, once again, in the form of air defense. The Maxson Quad Mount, the devastating M16 meat chopper of the Ardennes, was rebuilt and re-engineered into the TCM-20. The twin 50-caliber machine guns were replaced by two fast-firing 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannons. This gave the half-track a massive increase in range and lethality. The dawn of October 6, 1973, broke over the Sinai Peninsula, bringing with it the shock of the Yom Kippur War. Egyptian and Syrian forces launched massive coordinated attacks, supported by low-flying aircraft. Sergeant Major Avi Ben Yishai was manning a TCM-20 mounted on a modified M5 chassis near the Suez Canal. The air was hot and dry, smelling of diesel and dust, a scent that had clung to the M3 since North Africa 3 decades prior. Ben Yishai had his earplugs jammed tight, but he knew they would not stop the bone-jarring concussion of the 20mm cannons. Suddenly the alarm sounded. Two Egyptian Sukhoi Su-7 fighter bombers, flying low to avoid radar, screamed over the ridgeline. Their engines made a tearing sound in the desert silence. Ben Yishai slammed his foot down on the firing pedal. The twin cannons roared, emitting a high-pitched metallic chop. This sound was sharper, more violent than the old 50 caliber mounts had ever been. The armor plate around his modified Maxson turret vibrated so fiercely that his vision blurred for a moment. Instinctively, he tracked the lead jet. The high-explosive shells, each the size of a man's thumb, erupted from the barrels at an incredible rate. The air around the Sukhoi Su-7 instantly filled with tracers. The pilot attempted to jink away, flying directly through that dense stream of steel. A flash of orange erupted from the jet's belly. This was immediately followed by a thick plume of black smoke. The aircraft pitched violently, its speed decaying rapidly as it spiraled toward the sand. The M3 chassis, born from the compromises of the Great Depression, was now killing modern supersonic jets. The TCM-20s, the last direct combat descendants of the original M3, were credited with downing 26 aircraft during the 1973 war. It was a final, stunning testament to the platform's adaptability. Its service had spanned 3 continents and nearly 40 years of continuous conflict. The US Army had long since moved on to the M59 and M113 fully tracked carriers, fulfilling the modern promise of mechanized protection. But the M3 Half-Track, that dependable contrivance which had earned both its bad name and its combat stripes, had served as the crucial, enduring foundation. It cemented the understanding that mobility and armor, in any combination, were non-negotiable elements of modern combined arms warfare. The roar of its engines, even after all that time, was still the sound of a vehicle refusing to die. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.